Thank you, Kathleen. All right. So, and if you saw the last talk, this really builds upon a lot of that. It's almost a continuation of it, which is great. So well done, Kathleen, on managing those. So I'm a social scientist, and I work at Endgame, do a lot on the intersection of geopolitics and cybersecurity, but also given my social science background, I've done a lot of analysis in the past on institutions, cultural change, organizational shift, all those kind of things. And I've been in the security industry about 5 years now, and noticed a lot of the stuff that I used to study that applied to geopolitical conflict, interstate conflict. I could actually take some of those lessons learned and some of those policies and strategies and apply them to what I was seeing within the security community. And one of the things that I noticed, and especially compared to, I've worked in the military, I've worked in academia, the security industry is unique in some of the retention challenges that we face. And I wanted to kind of dive into it. I mean, that's what social scientists do. We want to start looking at the human behavior aspects of it. And so I did a study of it. And so I'm going to walk through the findings of the study and then some of the social science theories and strategies for addressing some of the retention challenges. And so basically, about a year ago, I did the analysis, so I'll talk about that. We'll walk through the analysis itself and some of the key findings, and then I'll talk about the recommendations for helping retain more people within the community itself and within organizations. And so what we hear a lot within we talk about the workforce shortage, that's something that I think all of us know really well, so I'm not going to dwell on that so much. But what's focused mainly on is the pipeline problem. I didn't see much going on in the area of retention. And so that's why the talk before was great, started to talk about some of the challenges we see with retention. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into it and look at what some of the causes might be. And so I did survey analysis, and actually did over last summer. Jack Daniel actually helped me propagate it throughout social media, which is always helpful, because this is actually a challenging community to get people to respond to surveys, as Kathleen probably found out as well with her analysis. A lot of people think you're out there fishing for some sort of thing, and I got a lot of comments along those lines that that's all I was doing. So at the end of the day, I got a little over 300 respondents. Which again, I'd prefer a bigger N, but you just take what you can get. And the distribution was 80% male, which actually is a little bit different from what our community is, so not awful. And what I was especially interested in was the industry breakdown. It was fairly consistent across the board. So it isn't one of those things that leans heavy towards startups or government or so forth. It really was a broad spectrum of respondents, and so I was very happy with that. And so after doing the analysis, it was about 20 multiple choice questions, which is a good way to actually frame the analysis, because people aren't willing to put in an hour to respond to anything. So you do the 20 multiple choice questions that covered a range of issues as far as why you stay, why you go, some of the key causes. Then a little bit of demographic information, and then in different areas for comments, and I include some additional comments. A lot of people actually did take the time to write in some additional comments, and it all pertained to retention. And so there are three areas three key findings that I've found. One was on career limitations. And this to me was one of the more interesting ones, and may come as a no-brainer to a lot of people, I think, within the industry, that that the career progression seems to stop if you want to stay doing technical work. And that's what a lot of people said over and over again. And so there was that lack of advancement, the lack of professional growth, where people kind of felt like they were stuck in a sort of a hamster wheel doing the same thing over and over again without seeing any progress available for them. And a lot of other fields that isn't there. You kind of know where you're going to be progressing, and you know what if you work for 30 years, you know where that that high level where you can aspire towards. And it's not quite there yet in security. And so that gets to some aspect. A lot of people say, well, it's because it's so new, but it's not so new that should still be an issue, but it really is. So it's one key takeaway, the manager or boss issue. I think that's pretty much across almost any industry. And so I don't think that's necessarily unique here, but it's interesting to see it reiterated. The lack of challenging work I thought was especially interesting, probably because we hear about how challenging and how what the cool work that we can be doing in security is. And so I think that's relevant, but I think a lot of it is that when people are coming in, though, they start doing a lot of the same kind of processes and redundancy in their work day after day after day, instead of being able to evolve into some of the higher level, more sophisticated work. And so I thought that was an interesting aspect of it that we don't hear talked about very much. And then the limited opportunities again for technical management. A lot of management basically requires doing more of the timesheets and so forth versus helping technically develop the workforce. And this is just one of the quotes that was in there, which gets back to, because within organizations, when there is little understanding of security or where security should be placed within that organization, there is no set career path. And a lot of these different comments along those lines talked about, we were placed in IT, we didn't really belong there, or they placed us over here, we didn't really, we were sort of an island. So a lot of those kind of issues were talked about in some of the comments. And this is just some of my favorite comments from Twitter that I think just kind of dives into this a lot more, especially when we're starting to look at what kind of people we're hiring for, and the kind of experience doesn't necessarily match what people are doing. And so these are just a couple of my favorite ones on that area. So burnout is next, and I think that again comes as probably no surprise to this community, but what's interesting, I think to the outside world, it actually is a little bit. I was just interviewing, Jack Daniel was for an MIT Technology Review article that came out today on burnout. And it's starting to gain greater visibility. You've got the whole, Black Hat's got the whole track now on these kind of issues. But it really is one of the major causes for people leaving both companies and leaving the industry. And I asked both those questions, because why people leave the company and the industry can be two different things, but they were pretty consistent on that in this area. And so part of it was that that security basically was rested on the shoulders of just the security professionals, and it wasn't dealt with as an organizational whole responsibility. And so the accountability rests on one person, and because it rests on one person, that means they're constantly, again, just working overtime. That, as we all know, there's no rest time during any of this. Things don't stop. Generally, a lot of these major attacks tend to happen over holidays or really inopportune moments. So I'll put those up, just some more comments along those lines. But it is a constant stress, and the paper in the MIT Technology Review today, I think, is pretty good. It covers a broad range of these topics. And again, it's one of it also gets back to some of the feedback cycle. So you're still working really, really hard, but if your customers, first, when you're trying to prove something that might be unprovable in many ways, especially to customers that may not understand that the technology aspect of it, you really don't get the accountability or the recognition for all the hard work that you're doing. And then again, just a couple comments on burnout. And I'll address some of these more so when I get into some of the recommendations, but one of them is on vacations. I think probably most of us, unfortunately, do a fair amount of work on vacation, more than we should at least. And as every other study shows, vacations actually should be a time for taking time off. You actually come back more refreshed. But that's not really how a lot of us do it in this industry. I mean, that's something that we see in other industries as well, but I think it's especially pronounced within security. And then finally, we'll talk about industrial changes. So that gets into the changes in the industry culture. And so part of this isn't necessarily what we hear about a lot. Some of it is that half of my respondents were between 31 and 40. So when we see all the sort of the cultural stereotypes that are out there of the 15-year-old hacker, that's not actually reflective of the security industry itself. And so part of it, there's a branding challenge that we have within the industry, and some of it falls on us, but it may not fall, also can fall on the companies as well to reshape what this vision of what security is, what the job potentials are, what the opportunities are, those kind of things. A third of the response pointed to security culture, and what an interesting component of this is, one aspect that kept being brought up in the comments was the bro culture, and it was all self-identified males that made those comments, which I thought was especially interesting. Also, I think a lot of women are tired of talking about it, but the men, were very vocal as far as how the negative impact it was on them as well, and so I think that you see as well in some of the tweets on the right, basically issues with the social aspects being heavily reliant on drinking, all the manuals that we see out there, those kind of things are good into together they help build this culture that may not be, they take that culture and you combine that with the burnout, you combine that with the career progression, and you get a lot of retention challenges. On the positive side, and seeing that's retention, what makes people stay, which is something that we do also need to be focusing on, these are some of the top aspects for what keeps people staying within their jobs. And again, I think these are fairly similar and aren't necessarily unique to the security industry, except for the mission aspect. I mean, the mission here, I do think is extremely important. It absolutely can be viewed as heavy, weighted heavier and more important than what we see in some of the other tech industries. So I do think that's something that, as an industry, we should absolutely take to our advantage when we're trying to retain people. That's about the impact that we can have. Stimulating work as well is sort of the mirror image of the lack of challenging work, so it's not a surprise. Supportive boss manager keeps you there, whereas an unsupportive boss or manager is why you leave. Professional development, which again was talked about in the last talk, extremely important. And again, and how professional development is actually applied is really, really important. Just putting money into professional development box and no one ever uses it really doesn't count as professional development. And so Unfortunately, a lot of companies just kind of do it that way. They think they can throw money at it and move on from there. So what can be done about all that? And I think probably for a lot of us, those three high-level findings, the lack of the career trajectory, some of the cultural aspects, and burnout, probably don't come as much of as a surprise. We all anecdotally, I think, have felt at least one, perhaps all three of those as something that may want to question whether we belong in this industry or whether we want to retain working in this industry throughout our career. And so we know that problem's there, and just identifying the problem obviously is part of the solution, but we actually need to start looking at solutions instead of just continuously highlighting some of these challenges. And I feel like for a while, last few years, when we see media reports on security industry along these lines, a lot of it is just highlighting the problem without really getting into solutions. And so what I want to do for the remainder of the talk is really focus on some solutions or ways that I think we can look at addressing it. And one, by no means do I think I have every solution in here. Obviously, everything has to be customized to organizations and so forth. But I think there's some overarching themes that have been proven time and time again organizationally to help improve retention within companies. And so for social science, one of the key ways we kind of break down the way social systems are extraordinarily complex. They're open systems, which makes it even harder. So any of those system dynamic models, I argue, don't work really well at all for social system analysis, even though I've seen that tried before, and it tends to be a disaster of a spaghetti ball chart. So instead of looking at something like that, we look at the agents, who are basically the motives and ideas of individuals, and look at the individual aspect of it. Then you look at the structures, the environment, the institutional constraints, the various parameters that are out there within which the agents function. And honestly, there have been lengthy dissertations on which matters more, the agents or the structure, and there are huge debates on, and then at the end of the day, they both matter. And so that's my perspective, and so we need to look at both. And so I'll start with some of the structural factors. Within organizations, one are the policies. And so the first one, the performance metrics and recognition. Again, when looking to the survey responses, a lot that the folks highlighted as part of the reason for leaving is the lack of the recognition. So the point that they're working very, very hard. If they complain about being tired or needing time off, they're told they're not passionate enough about their work. So we need to actually start looking at what the performance metrics are and how we're recognizing the people for the work that they're doing. And so again, it's one of those things where say a breach doesn't happen over that some course of time. How can you integrate something like that into some of the metrics? How can you integrate something that even if a breach does happen, people aren't going to be concerned that they may lose their job because of it? And so there are some issues along those lines that we really need to start thinking about as an industry. How can we start rewarding people for their performance, for their hard work, in a way that actually takes into account the unique aspects of security? Another one is sort of the notion that security professionals within organizations are their enemy. And so I heard that a lot in some of the comments that, when going around trying to help different people out and trying to either update their systems, help them learn some of the patch management, working on two-factor authentication, some of the very basics, there's a lot of organizational pushback against the security folks. And so they kind of felt like they were, working up a river trying to do their job. At the end of the day, we need to have that shift in the mindset, whereas the security professionals within organizations are viewed as friends, as allies, as there to try and help make the organization succeed in the business. Not there to be a hindrance, not there to slow everyone down. And so that's going to take a give and take, right? So security professionals also have to understand that people that they're working with have their job to get done and have their own business incentives. And so it does go back to where are incentives, where are people trying to go, what do they need to do for the businesses? And so trying to find the happy medium and work together instead of seeing it as an enemy. Another aspect is leveraging technology. Again, we're starting to see more of this come to security. A few years ago when I joined in security, most of the interfaces I saw, and I used to do a lot of user experience interface research, a lot of interfaces I saw were looked like they were about 20 years old, right? So where we saw, the technology industry, a lot of the applications have moved ahead and really leveraged the user experience component of it. Security seemed to be lagging a little bit behind in that, or quite a bit behind. I think we're starting to catch on to that and realizing that we can leverage more friendly user interfaces, some aspects of automation, leverage automation where it's relevant, you leverage user interface and user experience where that's relevant, and really optimize the human-computer interaction is where we can start moving ahead to make a lot of this work more accessible and also more efficient. So it's more accessible for more junior analysts and more efficient and timely with less of that redundant kind of processes for analysts across the board. PTO policies, I think, is one that I think is especially important, that kind of seems like, oh, it's like a no-brainer, but I think it gets overlooked a lot as well. Especially when you have a completely open PTO policy, right? That tends to be something that a lot of people tend not to actually use it as much as they would if they were given X amount of weeks during a time period. And so we need to find a way within companies, and every company's going to have some different strategies for this, that when someone's on PTO, to not bug them with their emails, to not expect them to be producing whatever reports or projects, to not be available 24/7 for various phone calls. And I think it's really hard. It's hard with it requires some sort of mindset shift, but also requires getting to a point where other people can help each other out and carry on some of the responsibilities. So I think that's a really important thing that we need to work on. And finally, some of the corporate social events, which gets at some of the cultural aspects of it. Are all the corporate social events, do they all pertain to happy hour with drinking? Are they all things that basically appeal to a certain subset of the workforce, and maybe not to the other subset? And so you need to find a variety of things, and this can be everything from like a book club may work for some group, and that would be great. So keep doing things along those lines, to the happy hour, which doesn't mean no drinking at all by any means. Just making sure that's not the only option. To sporting teams, get people who are athletes like to go out, make maybe more morning runs, those kind of things. Just finding other activities outside of the work for people to find those interactions, because those interactions outside of everyone just at their keyboard are really, really important. And it becomes even more difficult when you start thinking about distributed workforce. But there are ways to find meaningful ways to find various outlets for people to work together and find something to talk about outside of the work. Because when you're having those discussions outside of work, somehow they often lead back into something along work that you wouldn't have come up with otherwise. And so there's sort of those spontaneous conversations that I think are really important, and they rely heavily on those social interactions and ensuring that there are those events that are accessible across the board for the entire demographics, aren't just aimed at a certain group of people. And that's why ensuring they're not just reinforcing the problem, they're actually trying to solve it. Conferences, which is relevant since we're here right now. And I will say, besides Las Vegas, I think does one of the better jobs at creating more of an inclusive environment. Conferences, about 95% of respondents attend conferences. They're a very big deal in this industry, I think, as we all know, and I think more so than in some other industries. They're great for professional development, they're great for networking, they're great for hiring, they're a really good way just to learn more about the cutting edge of what's going on, and we all know these things. The problem is when some of these conferences reinforce some of the challenges. So even if as a company, you're doing all the right things, you're doing the professional development, you have the career track, you're doing great things for growth, if when people are going to conferences and having really awful experiences, they're going to bring back some of those experiences back to the company and may not want to stay within the industry. And so some of the experiences at conferences are what people spoke about. And so that's one thing when we're talking about the boomerang effect. So even if companies are doing things right, if the conferences, which are such a key part of the community, aren't doing some of these things right, it may have a negative impact on those organizations. And so there's been a ton written about codes of conduct and actually complying to those codes of conduct, so I won't go into that much. The speakers, the male representation, all those kind of things, ensuring that those speaking at the various conferences are more representative of a broader workforce, I think is really, really important. And some conferences do this much better than others. CFP processes, I think, are actually really interesting. I've been on probably a handful of different review committees, and how you end up doing them really has a big impact on the range of speakers that get accepted. And so when you do blind reviews, when you do double rounds of reviews, those kind of things, you start to get a different look at the various speakers that are coming in. And I think that's really, really important because there's a lot, the unconscious bias to, we know who the speaker is, we know they're going to do a good job. We've never heard of this speaker. That one limits new people from coming in, and so that limits their own professional development, but also ensures the same voices are just heard every time. And I personally like going to conferences where there are new speakers there that I've never heard their opinions before. I think that's a nice way to grow and learn from new people. Another aspect is sponsorship and professional growth. Companies again can put their all the companies that are out there saying they're in favor of creating a more inclusive security environment. Sponsor some of those aspects then as well, and use those for professional growth. Some companies are much more willing to send their people to conferences than others are, and so I think again, saying that you're in favor of professional growth and then enabling that is another aspect of it. And again, the quote on the bottom I think kind of drives home a lot of this. the impact of conferences, I think, really is sort of those network effects with publishing work, finding co-speakers from different companies. All those kind of things help people stay within the community and really enjoy the community. And then finally, visual cues, again, focusing on the structure, the workplace environment and decor. And this isn't, one of the things I've heard so many times from leaders is, well, we bought a ping pong table and a beer fridge, so why aren't they happy? That's not really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the workplace environment and decor. That's, and actually one of the things on the study for why people stay, I put these perks, not the benefits, not healthcare and those kind of things, but perks as far as the beer fridge and what other ping pong or foosball or whatnot. People don't care about those when they're actually making their final decision. So I'm not talking about that, although that's what a lot of, I think, leaders, when they say they're throwing money at it, that's the easy thing that they do, and I think that's, honestly, in many ways, putting lipstick on a pig, it doesn't necessarily work very well. But the workplace environment at the same time does need to be something that's not offensive, needs to be somewhere where people who tend to like to work on their own have a private place to go, while at the same time having places for people to work together as groups, provides places for social gathering, all those kind of things. To understand how people work in very different ways, and while at the same time also ensuring that the decor matches the culture the company wants to have. Power of swag, and this one I think is actually really, really important. When I first started Endgame, we didn't have any women's shirts that we gave out at conferences, and that drove me nuts. Fortunately, that has shifted a bit, and I'm starting to see more of other companies are doing that. But just little things like that just signal to various groups that, okay, you're welcome here, you're invited, you have a place and you belong here. Not doing things along those lines really is impactful. And so the same thing goes with, if you're at if you're a conference sponsor and all of your swag has to do with alcohol, perhaps, maybe you want to consider doing something else as well, like a notebook. I mean, who knows? But you just start broadening it out to make it inclusive to a broader group of people. And at the end of the day, when people first walk in, and this gets back to some of the recruiting that was talked about earlier, people also make that quick-minute decision when they're walking into your office to decide whether they want to work with you. And when they're looking around the decor, if it looks like a welcoming and open place that might be doing cool work, they're going to be more prone to take that next step and consider that if they walk in and all of a sudden they really don't feel like they belong there, that's immediate. That's within 15 seconds, and that's a very hard image to shake. And so that's some of the structural aspects, and I'll run through the leadership and personnel aspects now really quickly. So we just did all the environmental aspects. Now what can people as individuals do? So on the one hand, leadership is what's highlighted. Like, this is a leadership issue. It's not necessarily an issue for other people. I don't believe that at all. I think leadership is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so leadership absolutely has to lead by example. And so that's sort of the no-brainer. And this is something that if all your leaders either don't talk about any of these shifts, they don't talk about professional development, they don't talk about how they're handling burnout. If the cross-leadership board, it's a pretty homogenous group, that's setting the example. So that's what I mean by that. They also need to establish the policies, though. So when talking about those structural factors that occur, the policies actually have to help promote that. And one of the good examples is the professional development. Ensuring the policies are in place so that people can then leverage a lot of those professional development opportunities that are out there. Also, it's not all about the money, and that's when you see a lot of the metrics for, especially in the tech industry, for they threw however millions of dollars at, say, inclusion or at development, and they find that nothing has shifted over a year or after 2 years, after 3 years. It's because just throwing money at the problem isn't the solution. It has to be smartly allocated. And honestly, a lot of these solutions, in my mind, don't require much money at all. Some of them are actually almost free, so if not completely free. And so just throwing money is not going to be the end all. And I think that's also getting a lazy way for leaders. They're addressing an issue when they're not really. The greater representation, they can ensure that as far as helping with the recruiting process and so forth, and the metrics, actually helping to work with the various technical teams to ensure the metrics are appropriate for the jobs at hand. But for the rest of us that may not be on the C-suite, something that I coined cultural entrepreneurs. So policy entrepreneurs are people who kind of they see a gap in policy and they kind of go through and they help push through new changes in those policies. And so I think cultural entrepreneurs can do the same thing. And so that's where coming from the grassroots up. And so it's not just a leadership issue to address all these challenges. It's on all of us as cultural entrepreneurs within our organizations to help be the change that you want to see. Other people aren't going to do it. If we just all just sit back, nothing is going to change. So it is on all of us. It helps foster social capital. And social capital are basically the linkages across and within teams that actually help lead to things like economic development, more stable governance, all those kind of things. The same is true in organizations. And so it's this notion of leadership from below. And so to summarize, so we have a couple minute or two for questions. One, there's no easy button. This is the one thing that kills me on all these things for retention. It's like, oh, we're just going to throw some money at retention and it'll work. That's not how it happens. Or we'll just get a ping pong table and people will be happy and stay. Not how it works either. So it's not easy. It's actually quite hard. It actually requires a lot of the human element combined with the technical element, which I think is why so many organizations struggle with it. So it's no easy button. Not all the money in the world. It actually doesn't require a ton of money to do a lot of these things. They're very, very simple. Especially for small organizations, it shouldn't require much money at all. And so I actually have a lot more details on the results of the study and on the white paper itself at the address below. It's a white paper that goes into a lot more detail with some additional links and so forth on this research. So thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. Any phenomenal questions? Margaret, do you have any questions for her? Calling you out, yeah.
Actually just reading an article that she tweeted about earlier.
Sorry, can you take the mic?
Give me a moment. I saw something you had tweeted this morning about an article talking about stress in the cybersecurity workforce. Do you go into that at all in this white paper? Or
I do a little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Not as the only topic. The whole paper's not about that, and it could be, right? But I do talk about it a bit more within the paper itself. Yep. And as part of the underlying, leading into the burnout aspect.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Thank you. And just out of curiosity, do you see of the respondents to the survey and some of the data and the research that you've done, do you see a difference between smaller companies and larger corporations in how this manifests itself from a retention perspective?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I asked about sectors, but not company size. So quantitatively, I can't answer that. Qualitatively and anecdotally, from talking to a lot of this, I've given this talk a couple different times. And the first time I gave it, a guy from JP Chase basically said, this is great, I'm going to implement it, and it works very well with how we're thinking about addressing retention. And following up with him like that, it seems like good strategies for companies. I mean, that's a pretty large company. And then we've applied some of these at my company where we're when we were 60, 70 people. So I think at a high level, I think there are enough commonalities. Again, it gets to the notion of customization per organization. So I don't necessarily think it's the size of the organization. I think it's making sure to adhere to the business and cultural objectives within the companies itself. Because even at the large companies, they're going to, something like JP Chase is going to be very different from the security team of an Exxon, right? And how they're going to be fitting in with the rest of the companies. So I think that's probably more of the nuance that I would think about. But at the end of the day, I think the overarching strategies can work, and the overarching findings probably are pretty consistent. It's getting to the details of the companies themselves where we start tweaking it.
One more question? Okay. And for our friends in cyberspace, if you could speak into the mic so we can hear your questions and then her answer.
Excuse me. How do you address the requirements section of job postings where it can where on one hand HR wants to not have a deluge of applicants, but you don't want to make it so intimidating that people perhaps with intuitive knowledge or on the work knowledge are too intimidated to apply?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I've studied that elsewhere. Within this, I focus more on the retention. I view that as pipeline, but I've done enough research into that to at least have some thoughts on it. I think the way that we write our job descriptions generally is really harmful to what organizations are looking for. And that's sort of on the one side with the different tweets about, we want a junior, professional with, 20 years of some language or something along those lines. Like there's that, like it's written as a joke, but there still are way too many along those lines. Or we want someone, we'll hire you as a junior, but you have to have like 5 different certs. And maybe those certs aren't even relevant for the job they're going to be doing at hand. So we do I think honestly the talk before did a really great job talking about how we need to start doing a better job, making the job descriptions match to what the job that they're actually doing. And as an industry, thinking about how important the certs are, how important the various educational tracks are. I mean, that's, for me, I've worked on teams that have someone who didn't graduate from high school with a PhD on the same team, working side by side, and both were phenomenal, both contributed enormously to our company, and I would not weigh the value of one or the other. So we have to understand that there are so many different career trajectories into security. I think actually on Twitter a little while ago they did sort of like, tell us your track into security, and everyone's story is so very, very different, and the job descriptions I think need to better grasp that and better grasp the nuances, especially when we're seeing that all the technologies are changing so fast If we want people to actually stay longer than that technology life cycle, we need to look at more of the things as far as the curiosity and teamwork and critical thinking, in addition to their technical skills. So I think we have a long way to go as an industry, and I think that we're acknowledging that there's a problem, but I haven't seen a ton of change coming in that area yet.
So the Twitter handle or the Twitter hashtag she's referring to is my weird path into InfoSec. Actually, several well-known people have sort of outlined, threaded on Twitter what their career path has been, and I've actually done 2 or 3 presentations on that. Andrea, thank you for finally coming and presenting at Higher Ground. Let's give her a round of applause.